They say a smile can hide 1,000 sorrows. On Christmas Eve 1854, I proved it could hide something far more dangerous. A plan to burn an empire to ashes while its kings slept in their beds. My name is Ada. I am 38 years old. I have served the Bradshaw family of Natchez, Mississippi for 23 years. And tonight, as I pour their wine and arrange their silver, as I listen to their laughter echoing through that grand dining room, I am counting down the hours until I take everything they love and turn it to smoke. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all great fires begin, with the single spark of injustice so hard it can ignite a soul. It was 3 weeks ago, November 28th, when they burned my husband alive, Henry. My Henry. 39 years old, tall and strong, with hands that could mend anything broken except the system that owned us both. They accused him of stealing a silver pocket watch, a watch Master Bradshaw's own son had lost in a drunken stupor down by the river. Henry never touched it. He couldn't have. He was with me that entire evening, mending the fence behind the quarters. I remember because we talked about winter coming, how the wind would find every gap in our cabin walls, how we'd need to stuff the cracks with moss and mud again. Simple talk. Survival talk. The kind of conversation that fills the spaces between heartbeats when you're trying to find small joys in a life that offers none. But facts don't matter when you're property. Truth is whatever your master says it is. And Master Elijah Bradshaw said Henry was a thief. More than that, he said Henry needed to be made an example, needed to be punished in a way that would be remembered, needed to burn. They tied him to the old oak tree in the center of the plantation, the same tree where they'd hung 2 men the year before for trying to escape. That tree had become a monument to terror, its branches twisted from the weight of bodies, its bark stained with blood and fear. But hanging was too merciful for Henry, Elijah declared. An example had to be made. A lesson had to be taught. Theft would not be tolerated. I was forced to watch. We all were. Every slave on the Bradshaw plantation. 147 souls lined up in rows as the sun set on that cold November evening. The air smelled of wood smoke from the quarters and coming frost. Children cried until their mothers hushed them with desperate whispers. Old men stared at the ground, having seen this horror before, knowing exactly what was coming. Young men clenched their fists and felt the weight of chains they couldn't break. Master Elijah stood on a wooden platform with his entire family. His wife, Mistress Lillian, thin and cold as a winter blade. His 3 brothers, Charles, Stephen, and Andrew, each one a mirror of the same cruelty wearing different faces. Their wives stood behind them, silent women who'd learned long ago that mercy was weakness. And Elijah's eldest son, Robert, 23 years old, and eager to prove himself a man through violence. 8 adults in total, dressed in their finest clothes as if they were attending the opera rather than a murder. The younger Bradshaw children had been kept inside, spared the sight, but not the lesson. They'd hear about it at dinner, learn that this was normal, that this was justice, that this was how you maintained order over people you considered less than human. Elijah's voice carried across the property, strong and clear and
completely certain of his righteousness. "Let this be a lesson," he announced. "Theft will not be tolerated. Disobedience will not be tolerated. You are property, and property that steals deserves to be destroyed." He went on for several minutes, turning Henry's execution into a sermon about discipline and order. He quoted scripture, he quoted law. He made himself the hero of this story and Henry the villain. I stood in the 3rd row, held in place by 2 other house slaves who knew I'd run to Henry if given the chance. Not to save him, there was no saving him, but to die with him, to refuse to live in a world this evil. But they held my arms tight and whispered, "Live, Ada, live, bear witness, remember." So I stood, and I watched, and I bore witness, and I remembered every single detail of what they did to the man I loved. They doused Henry in lamp oil first. 3 buckets poured over his head and body until he was soaked, until the smell of petroleum overwhelmed everything else. I can still smell it now, all these weeks later, that sick, sweet scent mixing with the autumn air and smoke and the sweat of 147 people being forced to watch murder and call it justice. Henry looked at me across the crowd. We were maybe 30 feet apart, but it felt like miles. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He didn't give them the satisfaction of fear. He just looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw everything we'd built together in 15 years of marriage. The stolen moments of joy, the whispered dreams of freedom, the quiet morning conversations before dawn when we'd pretend, just for a few minutes, that we were people instead of property. The nights we'd held each other and felt, however briefly, that love could exist, even here, even in hell, even in chains. And then he mouthed 2 words. Live free. Not live, not goodbye, not I love you. Live free. His last words to me. Shaped by lips that would never kiss me again. Spoken without sound because even his voice had been taken from him. As if freedom was possible, as if I could do anything but survive. But I understood. He meant, don't let them kill your soul. Don't let them make you nothing. Don't let them win. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would live. And I would make them pay.
Robert Bradshaw lit the torch. His father handed it to him personally, making it a family affair, making it a rite of passage, turning murder into tradition. The torch was pine, soaked in pitch, burning bright and hot. Robert held it high for a moment, letting everyone see, making sure the lesson was clear. Then he touched it to Henry's oil-soaked clothes. The flames caught instantly. They rose so fast, faster than I imagined fire could move, racing up Henry's body like something alive and hungry. His clothes burned first, then his skin. The smell hit a moment later, that horrible smell of burning flesh and hair, a smell I had never known and would never forget. It was sweet and wrong and made my stomach twist, but I did not look away. I could not. I had promised with my eyes that I would watch, that I would bear witness, that Henry would not die alone. He screamed. God help me, he screamed. I thought he might stay silent, deny them even that, but pain like that cannot be endured silently. It's not human, so he screamed, and I counted the seconds. 47. 47 seconds of agony before his throat closed, or his lungs failed, or his mind slipped mercifully away. 47 seconds that felt like 47 years. 47 seconds I will hear in nightmares until I die. After that, there was only the roar of flames and the smell of burning flesh and the sound of the Bradshaw family walking back to their house, discussing what they would have for dinner. They walked away as if they'd just finished a chore, as if they'd done nothing more significant than prune a tree or brand a cow, as if they hadn't murdered a man for a crime he didn't commit. They left his body on that tree for 3 days as a warning. 3 days while birds circled and cold winds dried what the fire had not consumed. 3 days while Henry's remains turned into something less and less like a man. That was the point, of course, to show us what we were, what we could be reduced to, how little we mattered. On the 3rd day, they finally cut him down and let me bury what was left in the slave cemetery behind the tobacco barn. There wasn't much to bury, mostly bones and ash, pieces of the man I loved, reduced to fragments I could hold in both hands. I placed him in the ground myself, refused any help, needed to do this one last thing for him. I dug the hole with a shovel used to plant cotton and tobacco, the same crops that had made the Bradshaws rich. I dug until my palms bled. I placed what remained of Henry in that hole and covered him with Mississippi dirt that had drunk the sweat of enslaved people for generations.
As I covered him, as I marked the grave with a simple wooden cross, something inside me died and something else was born. It wasn't rage. Rage burns quick. This was colder, clearer. This was calculation. This was purpose. They had taken everything from me. Now I would take everything from them. But I wouldn't kill them. Death was too easy. Death was mercy. Death was what they deserved, and that meant it was too good. I would do something far worse. I would leave them alive to watch everything they valued turn to ash, just as I had watched Henry burn. I would strip them of their wealth, their pride, their security, their sense of control. I would make them understand what it felt like to be powerless. And then I would disappear, and they would live forever wondering if I would come back.
The Bradshaw plantation was one of the wealthiest in Mississippi. 3,000 acres of prime cotton land worked by those 147 enslaved people. The main house was a monument to wealth, built from human misery. A massive Greek Revival mansion with white columns, wide verandas, and imported furniture. But the Bradshaw fortune didn't rest on cotton alone. Master Elijah liked to brag that he'd built an empire on 4 pillars of wealth. And those pillars became the blueprint for my revenge. The first pillar was the cotton warehouse on the eastern side of the property, a massive wooden structure stuffed floor to ceiling with bales of cotton. Not just Bradshaw cotton, but cotton stored for smaller planters who paid him for the privilege. 2 years' worth, $80,000 worth. Enough to buy a small plantation. Enough to buy 100 more slaves, enough to matter, enough to hurt. Second was the stable. 12 horses lived there, pampered and groomed like prized nobility. But the jewel was Thunderbolt, a black stallion who'd won $5,000 at the Natchez races the previous spring. Elijah's pride, his status symbol, the thing that made other men envy him. Those horses were worth more to him than most people he owned. Third was the tobacco barn, older than the stable, built from oak that had weathered into silver. Inside hum racks of tobacco leaves, drying in precise airflow. $10,000 worth, waiting for shipment to Europe. Elijah had special pride in that tobacco, claimed it was the finest in Mississippi. It would burn beautifully. And fourth was the bridge, a simple wooden structure spanning Miller's Creek, but absolutely vital. The only way wagons could reach the plantation. The only way help could arrive. The only way the Bradshaws could escape if disaster struck. Without that bridge, the plantation became an island. 4 pillars, 4 targets, 4 pieces of Elijah Bradshaw's soul. Over the next month, I would study each one like a general studying a battlefield. The cotton warehouse came first. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I was sent with lunch for Marcus and Peter, the 2 enslaved men who worked there. That gave me access. I memorized everything. How the lamps hung, where the burlap sack sat, where the broken window board created a steady draft. In my mind, I watched it burn, saw flames start in the northwest corner, saw them spread swiftly, saw the entire building collapse inward like a dying beast. Next, the stables. 12 horses lived there, pampered and groomed like prized nobility. But the jewel was Thunderbolt, a black stallion who'd won $5,000 at the Natchez races the previous spring. Elijah's pride, his status symbol, the thing that made other men envy him. Those horses were worth more to him than most people he owned. Third was the tobacco barn, older than the stable, built from oak that had weathered into silver. Inside hung racks of tobacco leaves, drying in precise airflow. $10,000 worth, waiting for shipment to Europe. Elijah had special pride in that tobacco, claimed it was the finest in Mississippi. It would burn beautifully. And fourth was the bridge, A simple wooden structure spanning Miller's Creek, but absolutely vital. The only way wagons could reach the plantation. The only way help could arrive. The only way the Bradshaws could escape if disaster struck. Without that bridge, the plantation became an island. 4 pillars, 4 targets, 4 pieces of Elijah Bradshaw's soul. Over the next month, I would study each one like a general studying a battlefield. I would strike all 4. Fast, clean, merciless, on Christmas Eve.
Planning destruction was only half the battle. The other half was living with myself while I smiled and served dinner to the people I intended to ruin. December crawled by like a wounded animal, slow and painful, every day stretching longer than the last. Every morning I woke in my small room off the kitchen, a privilege for trusted house slaves, separate from the crowded quarters. My room was 8 feet by 10 with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a single window that looked straight at the oak tree where Henry had died. I woke to that view every morning. I fell asleep to that view every night. It reminded me why I was still breathing. Each day, I dressed in my gray work dress and white apron, the uniform of a civilized, obedient house slave. I braided my hair, pinned it up neat, washed my face in cold water that stung, and walked into the kitchen to begin another day in a house built from stolen freedom. And every day, I smiled. That smile was my armor. That smile was my weapon. Mistress Lillian noticed it first. During the second week of December, she watched me pour her breakfast coffee with what she called a cheerful spirit. She sat at the morning table reading a letter from her sister in Charleston, sipping delicately as if the world belonged only to her. "Ada," she said, "you're in a pleasant mood. That is good to see. Christmas brings out the best in people." "Yes, ma'am," I answered, steady as stone. "Christ is coming. It's a blessed time." She nodded approvingly. "Indeed, the celebration of our Savior's birth, a reminder of God's mercy." Then she added, like she was discussing the weather, "I doubt your people fully grasp the spiritual depth of the holiday. Your understanding is naturally more primitive." "Yes, ma'am," I repeated, every syllable obedient, every syllable a lie. Inside, I thought of the Christmas I'd give her, a holiday she'd remember for the rest of her days, a holiday she would never again celebrate without tasting ash. The Bradshaw family's annual Christmas gathering was the largest event of their year. Elijah's 3 brothers would arrive with their families, 23 people in total, 8 adults, 15 children, ranging from age 4 to 17. The next generation of slaveholders, learning daily how to command, punish, and own other human beings. All of them would go to bed on Christmas Eve believing the world was safe, believing that their wealth made them untouchable. And all of them would wake to a nightmare. Preparations for the gathering consumed the household. Mistress Lillian wanted everything perfect. She demanded polished silver, floors scrubbed until they shone, windows washed, guest rooms laid with fresh linens, and flowers placed in vases. She supervised every detail and assigned me to half of them. I volunteered for the other half. No one questioned why I was suddenly helpful, suddenly enthusiastic. "Look at Ada," I overheard her say one afternoon. "Such devotion. Losing Henry must have humbled her." Master Elijah nodded with satisfaction. "Discipline strengthens character, my dear. Consequences do wonders for the will." I continued polishing silver and smiled at my reflection in it. Calm, cold, determined. December 15th was the first step. I requested permission to buy kerosene for the house lamps, a routine task for a house slave entrusted with errands. Mistress Lillian approved instantly. I rode into town with old Jessie, bought 2 jars of kerosene from the general store, and on the way back, hid 1 jar behind the tobacco barn under a loose board. The other I delivered to the house as expected. No suspicion, no questions. On December 18th, I asked to visit Henry's grave, 3 weeks since he'd been burned. Mistress Lillian, caught up in Christmas spirit, allowed it. She even gave me a prayer book, believing herself gracious. I walked to the grave, knelt in the cold dirt, spoke to Henry, and told him what I planned to do. I pressed my hand against the rough wooden cross marking his resting place, and promised him that I'd make the Bradshaws feel the weight of their actions. Before returning, I retrieved the hidden jar of kerosene and studied the tobacco barn carefully, its loose latch, the best ignition points, the path I would take on Christmas Eve. On December 21st, I delivered lunch to Marcus and Peter at the cotton warehouse. While they ate, I walked through the aisles of cotton bales, testing bolts, checking the gaps between stacks, studying the airflow from the broken board in the northwest corner. I secretly loosened both door bolts, just enough to allow someone inside to escape if necessary, but still appear locked from the outside. I wasn't trying to kill enslaved people. My vengeance was reserved for the Bradshaws. On December 23rd, the final preparation. I walked the plantation grounds under the guise of looking for good light to mend clothing. In reality, I mapped my Christmas Eve route, from the kitchen door to the bridge, from the bridge to the tobacco barn, from the tobacco barn to the stables, from the stables to the warehouse, then north into the swamp. I timed it, checked sight lines, chose hiding spots, practiced breathing in cold air so it wouldn't mist visibly. It would take 45 minutes. 45 minutes to destroy an empire. Christmas Eve morning rose cold and bright. Frost clung to every blade of grass. No rain, perfect fire weather. A steady west wind that would push flames across the property in the exact direction I needed.
By noon, the Bradshaw relatives arrived in a procession of carriages. Horses snorted steam into the chilled air. Wheels crunched on the oyster shell drive. Children tumbled out laughing, running across the lawn like they owned the world. The adults strolled toward the house, weighted with coats and pride. Master Charles arrived first with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. Charles was the eldest Bradshaw brother, richer even than Elijah. Margaret was small, quiet, watchful. Next came Master Stephen with his wife Sarah and their 5 children. Stephen fancied himself religious. He preached to his slaves every Sunday about obedience and God's order. Sarah was a faded beauty who'd grown bitter with age and sherry. Last came Master Andrew with his wife Catherine and their 6 children. Andrew laughed loud, drank harder, and enjoyed cruelty more openly than the others. Catherine drifted through the world, numbed by laudanum and novels. 23 men, women, and children entered that house on Christmas Eve. 23 people who upheld slavery through action or silence. Not one of them would die that night, but all of them would live forever changed. I greeted them at the door, curtsying politely, collecting coats, welcoming them with a practiced warmth. My hands did not shake, my voice did not break. Inside, I was counting hours. 8 hours until midnight. 8 hours until justice. 8 hours until Ada became someone new.
The afternoon passed in a blur of labor and forced pleasantries. I helped prepare tea for the children, carried luggage up the wide staircase to the guest rooms, placed fresh towels in the washrooms, and arranged bouquets in porcelain vases. The smell of pine from the Christmas tree filled the parlor, mingling with the scent of cinnamon and roasted nuts drifting from the kitchen. Every detail of the Bradshaw holiday unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play, one they had performed every year. I had played my part in it for more than 2 decades, but this year my role had changed. This year, I served with the calm of a woman who had already decided her future was no longer chained to this place. At 6 o'clock, Christmas Eve dinner was served. The dining table stretched from one end of the room to the other, extended with polished mahogany leaves to seat all 23 people. Candlelight glowed from the crystal chandelier above, reflecting off silver plates and gleaming wine glasses. The tablecloth was white linen trimmed with handmade lace. The room looked beautiful, perfect, really. A scene designed for a painting about prosperity and family. And there I stood, serving the people who had murdered my husband. The feast took days to prepare. With Martha and Bueller beside me in the kitchen, we roasted 2 geese glazed with orange sauce until their skin turned golden. We cooked honey ham, sweet potatoes smothered with brown sugar and pecans, collard greens, cornbread, cranberry relish, pickled cucumbers, 3 kinds of pie, pecan, apple, sweet potato, and baked rolls brushed with fresh butter. It was the finest meal most people in Mississippi would ever see, and I carried each platter out with a steady hand and a smile. I carved the goose at the table, a skill Mistress Lillian had taught me years before. I poured wine for the men, milk for the younger children, cider for the women. I moved silently, gracefully, invisibly, as a house slave was expected to. But I watched them, and I listened. I watched Master Charles brag about his cotton yields. 800 bales this year, the best crop in Warren County. He bragged as if the land alone had worked, as if the sweat and broken backs of enslaved people meant nothing. I watched Master Stephen clasp his hands and lead the family in a long prayer, thanking God for blessings, for health, for wealth, for the labor of their people, as he called us. He didn't pray for mercy or understanding or repentance. He prayed for continued prosperity in the system that fed him. I watched Master Andrew grow drunk, as he often did, joking crudely with the men about a girl he'd sold last month because she dared resist him. He laughed loudly, leaning back in his chair, his face red from wine and self-satisfaction. His wife stared at her plate, eyes distant, pretending she didn't hear or see the cruelty in her own home. Mistress Lillian corrected her youngest son's table manners with a hard pinch under the tablecloth, scolding him for eating with too much enthusiasm. The older Bradshaw children whispered and nudged each other, giggling, practicing flirtation and confidence, learning already how to carry themselves as owners of land and bodies. Across the table, Robert Bradshaw, the man who had lit the torch that killed Henry, leaned toward his cousin Charlotte, whispering something that made her blush. He smiled with self-sure charm, completely unburdened by the memory of the man he'd helped burn alive 3 weeks prior. That moment, more than any other, hardened my resolve. At one point, Master Elijah raised his wine glass. "Ada," he called, loud enough that all eyes turned toward me. I set down the decanter and folded my hands in polite stillness. "Yes, sir," I answered, my voice soft and perfectly obedient. "You seem happier tonight," he said, smiling like a benevolent king. "That's good to see. You've been through a difficult time." The table murmured agreement. Every face turned toward me with casual curiosity. The kind of curiosity you'd direct at a dog that suddenly performs a trick. Not one person at that table saw a human being standing before them. Not one. I bowed my head. My voice did not waver. "Yes, sir, I'm very happy. This will be a Christmas none of us will ever forget." He laughed, delighted, slapping his palm on the table. "That's the spirit! See, everyone, even in hardship, the spirit of Christmas can restore. This is what good Christian influence accomplishes. Proper discipline produces loyalty. Ada?" My heart pounded against my ribs. I waited a moment. "Yes, sir. We're delighted with your position of service. We all depend upon you." "Thank you, sir."
The men nodded, the women smiled politely. Robert smirked with pride. And I, standing inches from them, smiled too, a smile that did not reach my eyes. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed the difference. They might have seen how still my hands were, too still. They might have seen how my eyes flicked occasionally toward the grandfather clock in the corner, watching the minutes march toward midnight. But they didn't look. They never did. They saw me as furniture, useful, obedient, unthinking. A tool, a utensil, something that existed to serve and nothing more.
They could imagine furniture polishing silver. They could imagine furniture cooking feasts or scrubbing floors. But they could never imagine furniture planning their destruction. After dinner, the family moved to the parlor for Christmas gifts and songs. The children tore open packages wrapped in bright paper. The adults sipped cider and coffee while singing carols. Silent night, joy to the world. Hark, the herald angels sing. All hymns about mercy and peace and divine love. Their voices echoed through the house, warm and cheerful. I washed dishes in the kitchen, humming along under my breath. At 10 o'clock, the children were tucked into guest rooms upstairs, chattering excitedly about Santa Claus and presents. At 11, the adults retired to their quarters, full of food and liquor, their bellies warm, their spirits high. The house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft creaking of old wood adjusting to the cold. My heart beat slow and steady, calm, purposeful. I went to my tiny room and changed into the dark clothes I had hidden beneath my bed. I tied my hair back. I slipped on worn shoes that wouldn't crunch loudly on frost. I took the bundle I had prepared: matches, a jar of kerosene, a small knife, bread, and cold meat. Everything I needed to burn their world and escape it. Quarter till midnight, I stepped silently out the kitchen door into the frozen night. The stars were sharp above me. My breath rose in small wisps. Not a single window glowed with light. The plantation slept. I moved like a shadow toward the bridge, the first target, the farthest one, the beginning of the end. Tonight, Ada would live free. Tonight, the Bradshaw Empire would burn.
The night was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but the cold steadied me. It kept my breathing even, kept my mind clear. The plantation stretched in silence behind me as I walked toward the bridge, each step measured and deliberate. Frost cracked softly under my shoes. Not a soul stirred in the big house. Not a lantern glowed. The only sound was the faint trickle of Miller's Creek beneath the old wooden span. When I reached the center of the bridge, I stopped. The moon hung low, casting silver across the water. The jar of kerosene felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it had earlier in the day. This was the moment that separated thinking from doing, planning from becoming. If I lit this fire, there would be no turning back, no forgiveness, no mercy, only consequence. I kneeled and poured the kerosene over the central support beams, over the railings, over the planks beneath my feet. The smell rose sharp and familiar, the same smell that had soaked Henry's clothes. I let it fill my lungs, let it burn my memory, let it remind me what I was here for. I struck a match. For a split second, its tiny flame flickered alone in the vast dark, like a star trembling before it falls. My hand didn't shake. I dropped the match onto the soaked wood. Fire bloomed instantly, bright and eager. It licked up the rails and raced across the planks, sinking into the crevices, crackling with life. Flames spread in both directions, orange tongues dancing along the length of the bridge. Within moments, the center beams hissed and spat as heat consumed them. I didn't stay to watch. I turned and ran toward the tobacco barn, my feet carrying me across frozen ground in long, quick strides. Behind me, the bridge roared louder, the flames swelling, reflecting off the creek like a burning mirror. The tobacco barn loomed ahead, tall, dark, and silent. Henry's grave stood nearby, a small, uneven cross in the moonlit dirt. I touched the cross as I passed, just once, a whisper of a moment. Watch me. Watch me give you justice. I pulled out the second jar of kerosene from where I had hidden it days before and slipped inside the barn through the side door with the loose latch. The darkness swallowed me. The rows of drying leaves rustled softly in the faint draft, filling the air with that earthy, curing scent I knew so well. I moved quickly but quietly, pouring kerosene along the wooden racks, across the dirt floor, over the thick clusters of tobacco hanging overhead. The leaves soaked it greedily. The barn felt alive around me, as though it already sensed what was coming. The air grew heavier, more flammable, more expectant. At the entrance, I made a thin trail of kerosene leading out into the night. Then I took a match, struck it, and dropped it onto the trail. The fire leapt forward, racing into the barn with frightening speed. Flames shot up the walls and ran along the racks, catching leaf after leaf, row after row. Smoke surged upward, thick and choking. Within seconds, the barn was a roaring furnace. Flames glowed through cracks in the wood, lighting the field outside with a hungry orange heartbeat. I closed the door and ran toward the stables. By now, the bridge fire lit up the edge of the property like a second sunrise. Flames rose high enough to be seen from the main house. It wouldn't be long before someone woke. I needed to move fast. The stable smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat. As I approached, the animals grew restless. Hooves scraped, low whinnies drifted through the cold. Thunderbolt, Elijah's prize stallion, let out a sharp snort. He sensed something wrong.
I entered through the rear doors, the ones that were always left unbolted, for safety, though only for horses. I climbed the ladder into the hayloft, carrying the jar of kerosene. The loft was piled with dry hay, more fuel than any fire could dream of. I hesitated only a moment. The horses were innocent. They had never harmed anyone. They had never burned a man alive. They were symbols of the master's pride. They were his trophies. I whispered, "I'll give you a chance to run." Then I poured the kerosene over the hay bales, across the floorboards, and down the rafters. When the jar was empty, I climbed back down. I threw open every stall door. Thunderbolt reared high, his eyes white with fear. I slapped his flank hard. "Go," I shouted. "Run!" He bolted through the rear doors, hooves pounding, mane wild. One by one the horses fled. Lady Grace, Duke, Napoleon, Traveler, Princess, Ruby, Captain. Some ran in perfect terror toward the fields. Some hesitated, confused by smoke drifting in from the loft. Then I struck a match and tossed it upward. The fire erupted with a whoosh so loud it made the horses scream. Flames devoured the loft in an instant, running across the hay in a fast, bright wave. Embers rained down onto the bedding in the stalls, igniting straw piles in seconds. I pushed open the last stall. Another horse panicked and kicked, nearly knocking me over. I shoved it hard, pushing its body toward open air. "Go!" Some escaped, some didn't, but they all had a chance, more than Henry had been given. I ran from the stable as the roof began to glow, smoke curling from the eaves. The shouting started. From the porch of the big house, someone screamed, "Fire! Fire on the property!" Doors slammed. Figures spilled out in nightclothes. Men shouted orders. Women cried out in confusion. The bell tolled, the plantation alarm clanging through the freezing night. Too late. Far too late. The cotton warehouse loomed ahead, the final pillar. Its massive outline glowed from the fires rising around it. I reached the back loading door first and slammed the bolt into place from the outside, jamming it with the loose wooden wedge I'd hidden earlier. To anyone looking, the door appeared locked, but someone inside, some enslaved worker, could force it open if necessary. Then I ran to the front. My breath shook now not from fear, but exertion. I poured the last of the kerosene along the front doors. My hands were trembling, not from doubt, but from adrenaline so intense it made my fingers feel electric. I struck a match. The flame kissed the kerosene-soaked wood. Fire spread eagerly, climbing the door, creeping along the frame, hungry for cotton. Cotton burns explosively, I knew that.
I had seen smaller fires before, flames that devoured weeks of harvest in minutes, but this would be something the Bradshaw name would never recover from. Behind me, voices shouted closer. "There! Someone's by the warehouse! Stop them!" I didn't look back. I ran toward the main house, not to save anything, but to leave my message, to leave truth carved in ash. I reached the front steps. The Bradshaw family was running toward the fires, not looking behind them, not imagining the danger could come from the woman who served them dinner hours ago. I pulled a piece of charcoal from my pocket and scrawled across the pristine white door. "Merry Christmas. You burned one man. I burned one empire. Ada." Then I ran into the night, toward the swamp, toward freedom, toward the woman Henry told me to become. I ran toward the slave quarters, but not to hide, never to hide. That would be the first place they searched when they realized what had happened. Instead, I sprinted past the cabins, toward the northern woods where the land dipped into the swamp. The night roared behind me. Fire cracked through the cold air. The warehouse burned like a furnace, flames shooting 70 feet into the sky. The stables had become a collapsing inferno, horses screaming and bolting across the fields, silhouettes of terror. The tobacco barn glowed like a lantern swallowed by its own flames. And at the edge of the property, the bridge burned down to glowing coals. The center section already collapsed into Miller's Creek. The Bradshaw plantation was an island of heat and chaos in a sea of frozen Mississippi darkness. I reached the swamp's edge, where solid ground turned to waterlogged earth and thick tangles of cypress roots twisted like knotted fingers. I stopped and turned. From here, I could see everything. The mansion, untouched, stood framed by fire on all sides, as though the world had caught flame and left only that one symbol of arrogance intact. Figures moved like frantic shadows between the burning buildings, their shouts carried across the night in bursts of panic. "Get water! Where are the buckets? Where are the men? The bridge is gone! Dear God, everything's on fire!" And then cutting through the noise like a blade came the voice I had been waiting for. "Ada! Ada!" Elijah Bradshaw screamed my name into the burning night, screamed it with rage, disbelief, and something else, something I welcomed more than fire itself. Fear. "Ada! Where are you? Ada!" He shouted again and again, each repetition more desperate, more broken. He knew. They all knew. The message on the door had made that clear. This was not an accident. This was not misfortune, not carelessness, not fate. This was justice with a human hand. This was the woman they thought they owned, the woman they believed broken, burning their empire and walking away. I allowed myself the smallest smile, invisible in the darkness, then turned and stepped deeper into the swamp. The ground sucked at my shoes, cold mud swallowed my ankles, cypress roots rose like black spears. But I knew this place. I had been born at the swamp's edge before being sold at 15 to the Bradshaws. My mother had taught me the safe paths, the dry ridges hidden beneath brush, the places where snakes slept and where the water ran too deep to cross. Those lessons, whispered in the earliest years of my life, had never left me. I moved like a ghost, sinking into shadows, leaving no trace. Behind me, the plantation burned louder, brighter. The fires merged into one monstrous glow that lit the sky like dawn. Sparks rose into the air, carried by the wind like tiny spirits fleeing the inferno. I walked until my legs trembled, walked until the burning behind me dimmed into a smear of orange on the horizon, walked until the cold air cut my lungs and my breath rasped in my throat. By the time first light crept over the trees on Christmas morning, I was 5 miles away, hidden inside a hollow cypress log near the old river road. I curled inside it, small as I could, my bundle held tight against my chest, and waited.
I watched the sun rise, pink and gold, quiet and clean, nothing like the flames devouring the Bradshaw wealth behind me. I chewed a piece of cornbread from my bundle, tasting earth on my fingers. For the first time since Henry died, satisfaction, cold, hard, steady, filled me. Not joy, not triumph, just the knowledge that they had felt even a fraction of the powerlessness they had forced on us. I stayed hidden for 3 days. I moved only at night, drinking from streams, eating sparingly, avoiding all roads, all towns. On the 4th day, weak and freezing, I took a chance. I approached a small farm on the outskirts of Woodville. I had chosen it carefully. I had seen the farmer once while accompanying Mistress Lillian into town. His coat, a plain gray wool with a broad-brimmed hat, marked him as a Quaker, and Quakers were among the few white people who openly opposed slavery. Some even helped runaways. Still, approaching him was a gamble. If he turned me away or turned me in, I would die. I knocked on his door at dusk. A middle-aged man answered, lantern in hand. His face was lined, weary, but his eyes were gentle. They widened when he saw me, my torn dress, my muddy feet, my exhausted posture. Recognition flickered over his features. He had heard. Everyone had heard. The Bradshaw plantation fire was already spreading through Mississippi as rumor and near legend. Slave woman burns 4 structures at once. A runaway named Ada destroys $120,000 in property. A single woman cripples one of the wealthiest families in Natchez. He stared at me like I was both terrifying and miraculous. "Please," I whispered. My voice was hoarse from nights of silence. "I need help." For a long moment, he didn't speak. I saw the war in his eyes. Fear fighting faith, rational caution battling conscience. Helping me could ruin him. If caught, he could lose his land, his farm, his life. The Bradshaw reward for my capture, dead or alive, was $500, more money than most people would ever see. Any man in Mississippi could have been tempted, but he stepped aside. "Come inside," he said softly, quickly. His name was William Foster. His wife, Emma, stared at me with a mixture of shock and resolute compassion. They fed me warm broth while they heated water for a bath. My hands shook as I held the bowl, not from fear, but from returning warmth. "You are either the bravest woman in Mississippi or the most desperate," William said quietly. "Both," I replied, "and I'm a widow." They exchanged a look, one full of grief and understanding, and said nothing more. For 2 weeks they hid me. Their cellar held a false wall built to hide runaways. They had been part of the Underground Railroad for 7 years. Dozens had passed through their home. None had been caught. Slave catchers scoured the countryside. They questioned every household, searched barns, peered into wells, interrogated enslaved people, threatened free black families, and hunted through the swamps with dogs and lanterns. They came to the Foster farm twice. Each time I hid behind the false wall, heart pounding as boots thudded overhead. Emma brought me news quietly in the evenings. The cotton warehouse, reduced to ash. Insurance denied, arson. The stables, destroyed. Half the horses dead. Thunderbolt shot after breaking his leg. The tobacco barn, nothing left but charred earth. The bridge, gone. The Bradshaws stranded for weeks. Total losses, more than $120,000. Elijah Bradshaw was ruined, financially, socially, and spiritually. His brothers returned home, severing business ties. Neighbors whispered. Banks refused loans. He slept little,
ate little, jumped at shadows. Mistress Lillian had taken to her bed, said Emma. She suffered what neighbors whispered was a nervous collapse. Robert Bradshaw avoided the big house, unable to walk past the scorched remains of Thunderbolt's stable without trembling. And everywhere, people whispered my name. Ada, the woman who burned an empire. When the searches finally eased, William and Emma moved me to the next station, north, toward a new life, toward a name I would choose, toward the freedom Henry had asked me for with his last breath.
From the Foster farm, the Underground Railroad carried me north like a silent current. We moved at night, always at night, slipping through forests, across fields, along back roads and old wagon trails. Each conductor, each brave soul willing to risk everything, kept me only long enough to rest, eat, and recover. Then I moved on. From Woodville, William and Emma sent me to Liberty, where a blacksmith named Thomas hid me in the loft above his forge. The smell of iron and coal clung to my skin for days, but the loft was warm, and warmth felt like a miracle. Thomas had helped dozens of runaways. He barely spoke, but when he handed me bread and smoked meat wrapped in cloth, his eyes carried more humanity than I had been shown in years. After a week, he passed me to a Methodist minister in Brookhaven, who kept me in his church basement while slave catchers searched the straits above. He prayed over me, softly, gently, asking God to carry me north safely. I didn't know if God listened to prayers from women like me, but I listened to the minister's prayer, and for the first time since Henry died, it did not sting to hear someone speak of mercy. From the church, I traveled to Jackson, where a free black woman named Sarah hid me in her attic. Sarah ran a boarding house, a modest white building with rocking chairs on the porch and quilts airing on a line. Slave catchers patrolled nearby streets daily. They stormed into town demanding information, dangling that $500 reward like bait. People whispered my name everywhere. The woman who burned the Bradshaw plantation. The woman who destroyed an empire in one night. The woman who vanished like smoke. Some stories grew grander in the telling. Word traveled faster than the truth. People claimed I burned the big house too, with the family inside. Others swore I cut the horses' throats before setting fire, or that I led a band of rebel slaves from 3 counties. I never corrected the stories. Let them grow. Let fear grow. Let every slaveholder in Mississippi lose sleep wondering if the people they owned were planning the same fate for them. I only corrected one lie when a kindly old woman in Sarah's boarding house whispered it. She leaned close and said, "They say you killed Elijah Bradshaw yourself." I nodded and whispered back, "No, I left him alive to watch everything burn." Her eyes widened. She nodded slowly. "That's worse," she said, "and better." The Underground Railroad carried me through Mississippi, then into Tennessee, then Kentucky. The nights grew colder. The air stung my skin. My shoes wore thin, but my legs carried me forward. I moved through the world with the memory of Henry's last words holding me upright. Live free. On March 15, 1855, nearly 3 months after I set the Bradshaw Empire on fire, I crossed the Ohio River into free territory. A conductor named Benjamin rowed me across on a small ferry under cover of night. The dark water reflected stars like scattered diamonds. The northern shore was a black line ahead, freedom hidden in shadow. When we reached Ohio's bank, I stepped onto land and expected to feel something. Joy, triumph, release. Instead, I felt hollow, empty, exhausted to my marrow. Freedom does not erase grief. It does not resurrect the dead. It does not mend the wounds burned into the soul. It only gives you a chance to keep breathing. I settled in Cincinnati, in the West End, where hundreds of formerly enslaved people were building new lives. I took the surname Freeman. Ada Freeman, Because I could choose now, because the name Bradshaw had no chains on me anymore. I found work as a seamstress. I rented a small room on 7th Street. I built a life piece by piece in the shadows of factories and workshops. I laughed occasionally. I slept without fear sometimes, but I never married again. Henry had been my husband. That part of me was buried with him under Mississippi dirt. I did not stay silent. I spoke at abolitionist meetings in church basements, in private parlors, in gathering halls filled with people who wanted to end slavery but didn't understand the depths of its cruelty. I spoke at gatherings of formerly enslaved people who understood every word without explanation. I told them about Henry burning while his killers ate supper afterward. I told them about serving Christmas dinner with a smile to his murderers. I told them about watching an empire burn from the swamp's edge, feeling only cold satisfaction. Some people called me a hero. Some called me a dangerous. Some called me a monster. I didn't care about their judgment. I cared only that they heard the truth. Slavery does not create weak people. It creates people with breaking points. It creates people who will burn the world before living one more day in chains.
My story spread beyond Cincinnati. Abolitionists repeated it across the North. Frederick Douglass mentioned the Christmas fire in a Boston speech, calling it an inevitable explosion of human desperation. William Lloyd Garrison wrote about it, condemning my methods while acknowledging their roots in injustice. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I didn't apologize. I had made my choice on Christmas Eve, 1854, and I lived with it. Through the Underground Railroad network, I heard occasional news from Mississippi. The Bradshaws rebuilt some things, but never their status. Elijah Bradshaw died in 1870, still wealthy but broken, still waking in nightmares. His sons sold the plantation in 1873 to pay debts. The land was split among strangers. The big house, where I had served them dinner with a smile, burned down in 1881. Lightning, they said. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I lived in Cincinnati for 38 more years. I volunteered during the Civil War, helping freed people adjust to a world that was still hostile, still cruel, still dangerous. I watched slavery end in 1865. I watched Reconstruction rise with hope and crumble under hate. I watched Jim Crow take the place of chains. Freedom was imperfect, incomplete, but it was better than what I had known. I died on March 19, 1893, in my small room on 7th Street, surrounded by women who had survived slavery themselves. My last words, they said, were, "Tell Henry I lived free." They buried me in Union Baptist Cemetery with dozens of formerly enslaved people. No newspaper wrote my obituary. No monument was raised. But the people who knew my story carried it forward. They told it at reunions, at gatherings, at church meetings. They passed it down to children born free who needed to understand the price of that freedom. The story changed with each telling. I became younger, taller, fiercer. Some said I freed 50 slaves that night. Some said I fought off slave catchers barehanded. Some said I burned the big house, too. I didn't mind. Stories grow so they can survive. But here is the truth. I was a woman who loved her husband, a woman who watched him burned alive, and a woman who responded with calculated devastation, not to kill, but to make them understand what it felt like to lose everything. I destroyed property, not people. I was not the monster they made me, but I made sure they knew this truth. There are fates worse than death. Living powerless, living in fear, living with your own cruelty burning you from the inside out. One night, on Christmas 1854, I stopped being property. I stopped being a victim.
I stopped being helpless. I was Ada, and I made them burn.